I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And, I have a reputation for reading a lot of history and a lot of fiction. And I'm so delighted I get to have this conversation with Matthew Delmont, who's a professor at Dartmouth. And he has a new book out called Until the Last Gun is Silent. And I think this book is really important. It is a new way to look at the civil rights struggle. It's a new way to look at the Vietnam War and the intersection of the two, which we don't always get. I think anyone who's done a lot of reading about the Vietnam War, and I think when you're an American of a certain age, this has happened. Um, we haven't had this perspective before. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. But I want to start with your dad, because your dad actually had a hand in the creation of this new book. And I have not met your dad, but
Yeah.
I like the way the story goes.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the program, and very happy to start with my dad because that's where I start the book. Broadly speaking, I'm a historian. All my work is on American history, history of civil rights, African American history. My last book project was on Black Americans in World War II, and so I say that by way of saying I came to this project because I want to continue that story into the Vietnam War era. And so I've been working on this for several years, and my dad knew I was working on it. He was sick with prostate cancer, and so I flew back to Minneapolis to visit with him, try to kind of make up for lost time, and get some of the stories I didn't get growing up to try to learn
Mhm.
more about his life and how it intersected with the kind of histories I study. And so before too long, we started talking about the Vietnam War era. And he told me kind of a funny story. He
Mhm.
was a track star at the high school he went to in Minneapolis, graduated in 1965, and he said he actually got recruited to run for the Air Force Academy, like something I'd never even heard before. He said it got pretty close to going through, but said something came up in the physical. And after that, he said the military didn't come looking for me, and I sure as hell didn't go looking for them. Right? That was his explanation of how he didn't get drafted into the Vietnam War. And so we kept chatting. He told me stories about there's a friend named Tony who was a good friend of his, and I remember Tony coming over, and I was sort of 9, 10 years old, and there were sort of these kind of coded messages they would convey to me as a kid, like don't play this particular video game. Let's not have any loud sounds in the house when Tony's over. I didn't really know what to make of it at the time, but looking back on it, it was obvious that Tony was a Vietnam veteran, and there were certain things that we didn't want to do when he was around. We kept chatting. My dad knew a lot of people who got drafted into Vietnam because graduated in 65. That was sort of the era. Then he got quiet for a minute and said, there was this other brother from Detroit who won the Medal of Honor, but they got him when he came back home. And he couldn't remember the soldier's name, but when I got home, I did what historians do. I started researching, looking into who this could have been, and it turned out it was a young man from Detroit named Dwight Skip Johnson, who in fact earned the Medal of Honor, was a tank driver, had this courageous moment where he fought his way out of an ambush, saved the lives of several men in his unit. And it was really that tip, that hint from my dad that led me to Skip Johnson's story. And Skip Johnson became one of the two key figures I highlight in Until the Last Gun is Silent.
So, what I love about Skip's story is he is genuinely an everyman, right? Like, young guy, I mean, has a great wife, has a great kid, ends up with a story that is familiar in some ways, unfamiliar in others. I will say, obviously, PTSD has a piece in this, and we didn't at the time have the language. PTSD wasn't even a phrase that existed for doctors at the VA. So, like, I'm just trying to give a little extra context around parts of his story. Obviously, we're not going to get into everything, but like, classic meets a nice girl. They're exchanging letters while he's overseas. Like, I love his wife. I really love
Yeah.
Katrina.
Yeah, Katrina's
She's great.
amazing. Yeah.
She's part of why we know Skip's story. And so the idea that you can follow this man and his family over decades and like we get a piece of the American story that we have not really had before. And then of course there's Coretta Scott King, who I mean, Coretta Scott, where do we start with Coretta Scott King? But I want to talk about that connection because you say, well, no, she never met Skip, but she was fighting for guys like Skip.
That's exactly right. So the two key figures in the book are Skip Johnson, through whom I tell the military history of the war, particularly the Black military history, but also the kind of working class history of the war. As you're saying, he was an everyman kind of figure. And then on the anti-war side, I focus on Coretta Scott King. Hopefully, her name is familiar to most listeners, as the wife and then widow of Dr. Martin Luther King
Right.
Jr. But what I want to do in the book is try to move her to the foreground,
Right.
because as I got into the research, to a level that even surprised me, she was really front and center at almost all of the major anti-war protests in the Vietnam era.
Yeah.
She was the most important protester in that whole movement.
I knew she was active in the movement. I didn't know that she was really how MLK got to his anti-war stand. Beyond Vietnam, obviously a very famous speech that he gave. 66 or 67?
67, April
Okay,
67.
67. He gives the speech at Riverside Church in New York, and there are immediate consequences. Everyone is mad at him. Jackie Robinson's mad at him. The NAACP is mad at him. Ralph Bunche is mad. Everyone's mad at him for
Even his
giving
own
this.
dad is like, "What are
Yeah,
you doing?" Right?
everyone is mad. But it's Coretta who even gets him to this point, and I don't think she gets enough credit for being sort of the power behind getting him to a point that he is obviously very well recognized for now.
That's exactly right, and that's what I try to demonstrate in the book. When you kind of follow it on a month by month basis and look
Hmm.
at where is she speaking, who's she in conversation with, who is she
Hmm.
organizing with, and who is she influencing, and then you start to picture. I mean, they were a tremendously important, influential married couple. They encouraged each other, they learned from each other, they respected each other, and in her case, she cajoled him to take this big step. I think thinking about the sort of timeline of it, when he
Mm,
gets the Nobel Prize in 1964.
right.
She sees that as a turning point moment. She sees it as a challenge. She's almost scared by it because she thinks,
Hmm.
our calling is much bigger than just a civil rights struggle. It's about human rights. It's about
Yeah.
peace. And she consistently challenges him on that. And that's how he ends up eventually making that important speech at Riverside Church in 67.
I mean, she seems to have had more of a global focus in many ways. I mean, she'd been reading about sort of the French in Asia and certainly America. And she was thinking more about the Vietnam War in terms of the legacy of colonialism than, of course, the communist threat, which is ostensibly why we were there in the first place and why the French were, everyone was doing their thing. But I love the idea that she's kind of off on her side, doing her thing, reading in a different way than maybe some folks might have expected or known. And I love the idea that this is absolutely something that drove her. And then she gets to the point where she's like, I'm a mom. I should care for everyone's children around the world. Like, we should all be invested in the survival and success of children around the world. Because, I mean, obviously, King himself is so identified with US and our domestic policies. And here she is saying, hey, wait a minute, can we stop spending all of this money overseas so we can invest here?
Yeah, it tracing her genealogy as an
Mm-hmm.
activist is so
Yeah.
important. So I
Yep.
start by talking about her in college at Antioch
Yep.
College in Ohio, 1945. She
Yep.
attends the Progressive Party National Convention in 1948, where you have a lot of sort of emerging radical voices. She gets
Mm-hmm.
to meet Paul Robeson, who becomes
Yeah.
her champion and her role
Mm-hmm.
model. When Coretta and Martin meet in Boston in the early 1950s, Martin is kind of blown away by how worldly she is. She's already a dedicated pacifist, and he reflecting on it says, I was part of what he found attractive in her was how intellectual she was and how committed she was to the cause. And then sort of fast forwarding into the 1960s, she's part of a group called Women Strike for Peace. So she's organizing with fellow women to call for the end to nuclear testing, flies to Geneva and is petitioning leaders there. And I think one of her big breakthroughs, as you were noting, was the kind of multifaceted critique she had of the Vietnam War once that emerges as the frontline issue. She sees the connection to colonialism. She understands that Vietnam, like other countries, is trying to establish its own independence on its own pathway, not wanting to have to choose between the US and the Soviet Union. And then just the fact that she's willing to speak out on issues of foreign policy. That was one of the big fault lines for civil rights leaders, that anytime they tried to speak on anything that wasn't U.S. black focused, they got harassed. Senator Dodd from Connecticut attacked Martin Luther King in '65 when he said anything about Vietnam. He said, "You have to stay in your lane. You don't. What do you know about foreign policy?" And so the fact that she was speaking so forthrightly and so early about foreign policy was extraordinarily bold for its era.
You know, I did have a moment though. I'm jumping back in time for just 2 seconds because here we've established that Coretta Scott King, incredibly well educated, incredibly plugged in, but also like 1963, let's face it, women are not necessarily given the roles that we would hope. And she's getting ready to march on Washington, and her husband turns to her and says, the wives are not marching. And it's 1963. People are a product of their moment. And this is part of why I read history, right? Because you need all of the different pieces of it. And yes, was I incredibly disappointed to see that? Of course I was. Am I very excited to see this new side of Coretta Scott King that didn't really, I had not fully wrapped my hands around as much reading as I've done about her. And I was like, oh, this is really great. This is so interesting and smart and different. And here we've got Skip Johnson, who Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King, certainly for him, would be beacons.
Mhm.
But the idea that, reality is still, this was 1963 in America.
Yeah, and when you go back and read the sources, read Coretta's the interview she gave about that, she was hurt,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
All those women were hurt because they understood how important they were to the movement. But when they're told that no women's are going
Mm.
to be making speeches at the March on Washington, they're not going to be in the front line marching. And then Coretta is in a limousine when Martin goes to the White House to meet with President Kennedy after,
Oof.
and she is hoping that she'll be invited
Hmm.
in. She asks Martin, "Can I come inside?" And he says, "No, it's only for the male leaders." And so she goes back to the hotel, right? But that sort of setup, if you know that
Right.
history, then when she's making these speeches in front of tens of thousands of people, when she leads a moratorium march in front of the White House challenging President Nixon, it gives it that much more power behind it because you
Hmm.
recognize
Yeah.
she's not just leading this movement for everyone else, but she's helping to claim her own voice that had been denied just a few years earlier.
Yeah, I have to say my feelings were hurt on her behalf in both of those moments. I
Right?
was I was mad. And then again, I had to remind I was like, oh, 1963, right?
Yeah.
1963.
Can I add an interesting thing
Yeah,
on that?
totally.
So historians love to talk about evidence, right? And so
Hmm.
one of the breakthroughs for me in doing this research was when I searched for Coretta Scott King, those
Yeah.
keywords in the historical newspaper databases, I would get about 300 results. If you
Hmm.
search for Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., you
Hmm.
get more than 1,000 results, three times as many, right? And so
Also,
it's the norms of the era.
I hate to say it too, like if you search her name, like how many recipes for pie were there? Like how many, like,
Yeah.
this is how I entertain my family. Like if you, the women's pages were a thing in newspapers, and that's where you saw Eleanor Roosevelt and Coretta Scott King and all of these women who obviously we have them, they're sort of notable now, but at the time, like literally it's like here she is entertaining her tea club or whatever. It's wild to
Yeah.
me.
Thank you for saying that because that's
Yeah.
what's so interesting, right? Because you read
Hmm.
those and they'll go between asking her like, how are your kids doing? How do you manage as a
Right?
mom, right? And then they're like, and I note that you just gave a speech at Madison Square Garden in front of 18,000 people, right? But you have to look at that part. It's not on the front page
Right.
often, right? It's in the women's section, but that's where the history was recorded.
And speaking of how history isn't recorded, like we wouldn't have necessarily gotten a record of Skip Johnson outside of here's when he was given the Medal of Honor. Like, yes, there's a military service record, what have you, but he's the kind of guy whose story didn't always get told. He didn't go on to become a sitting senator. He didn't go on to run a company. He didn't, I mean, unfortunately, his story does end in tragedy, but, and that's kind of all I'm going to say about it, because I really do want people to meet Skip on the page. But he's exactly the kind of guy who was fighting this war. He was the average guy who got drafted and sent overseas. And yes, he had this moment of great heroism. But like we would have lost his story except for a name on a plaque somewhere.
That's right. And that's part of what drew me to the story. When I was trying
Mm-hmm.
to think about how to get into the military history part of the story, I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to personalize it. I didn't want to get lost in sort of
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of names. But Skip does really represent the thousands of men that served in the Vietnam War. He grew up in the Jeffries projects in Detroit. He was
Yep.
a poor working class guy. He got drafted shortly after he graduated from Northwestern High School.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he serves in a tank unit, the 69th Armor. And then, like many veterans, he really struggled with the trauma that he experienced in the war. But when I wanted to tell his story, I didn't want to just tell it in terms of the heroic acts. He certainly
Yeah.
deserved the Medal of Honor for his heroism, but a big breakthrough for me was when I had a chance to connect with Katrina,
Mm-hmm.
his wife, who's now in her 70s, and she's just an amazing, feisty, passionate
Mm-hmm.
woman. But she was able to tell me their story and
Mm-hmm.
how they met when she was 15, he was 16. He
Right.
was flirting with her, wanted to go on a date. She wasn't interested. She was too busy playing baseball on the street, she said. But eventually they fell in love exchanging letters when he was deployed. They got married shortly after
Mm-hmm.
he came back to Detroit. They had a young son named Christopher. And
Yep.
so I try to personalize his story,
Mm-hmm.
not just talk about the military aspects, the sort of the fighting in the tanks, but he was in the Glee Club, he was in the choir. I found his old yearbook, right? He was everyone said he was a very kind, charming, funny guy, and that's the story I try to get onto the page.
And I think so much of the literature of Vietnam for so long. I mean, listen, I appreciate David Halberstam's work to no end. I appreciate Francis Fitzgerald, Stanley Carnow. Like there was a lot of really good work that went into recording the history of Vietnam, which I think we can argue too that we're still living in the shadow of a war that ended in 1975. Like I just, if you look at American foreign policy today, like we kind of learned nothing, honestly, fighting that war. But Again, maybe that's just my opinion. I happen to read a lot, that's all. um, but I think, again, coming back to Skip, it is so important to be able to say, look at this guy. Like, look at how he found himself here. I mean, he wasn't necessarily a direct result of Robert McNamara's 100,000 Man Project, but there weren't a lot of options for him career-wise. And the US military specifically has become a place where you can at least create a career, even excel. I mean, we've had some really, Colin Powell comes to mind. Um, but the idea that that's where your career lies, that you have to put yourself basically on the front lines,
It's
it's extreme.
Well, that's part of what drew me to the story as well, and I think it's a direct
Hmm.
connection to today. Is that
Hmm.
Skip was sort of illustrative of the common demographic profile of the men who got drafted to
Right,
serve in Vietnam, and then certainly since the military became an all-volunteer force in
right,
1973, from that point forward, Black Americans have always been overrepresented, and so the most of the young men and women who volunteer for service in the military today look a lot like Skip Johnson in terms of
right.
profile. A lot of working class folks from rural and Rust Belt cities, and so one of the things that I try to argue in the book is when we think about war and foreign policy, we have to think about the costs of war,
Right.
not just the economic cost of what it costs to fight, but the costs of on the men and women who serve and on their families as well.
I mean, one of the statistics that you pull out too, in 66, the Pentagon looks at the army, the racial makeup of the army, and it's 14%, just almost 15% of the army itself is made up of Black Americans.
Yeah.
The death rate for those same people is over 18%. So the death rates are overrepresented because they're on the front lines in a way that maybe other members of the army are not. I mean,
And part of the paradox of that is that's actually
mm,
something that Black Americans fought to have the opportunity to do.
hmm,
My
hmm,
last book was on World War II, and in that context, the entire U.S. military is racially segregated, and most Black Americans aren't given combat opportunities. And so, getting the military to be integrated, getting the opportunity to actually serve in combat, to become officers, to take on larger roles,
yeah.
was something that people fought for. They didn't want to have to come in the context of the Vietnam War in such a sort of fraught context.
And this is something that I wrestle with because, I mean, Vietnam is the first fully integrated US military, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, yay, progress. And at the same time, progress to me feels like it flipped on its ear. And again, I am not part of a career military family. I understand that there is a tradition that runs through, like, I mean, Nicole Hannah Jones has an amazing story about her dad in Iowa, and like he's been career military. Like, I understand that everyone has a different approach to this. I have a complicated relationship with a couple of things. I'm Japanese American. So,
Mhm.
yeah, history
Yes.
and I have a complicated relationship. Yeah, I'm also part Taiwanese, and then that gets even more complicated when you look at, like, you understand.
Yeah.
Um, but by the same token, to have the story laid out this way, to have the sort of larger umbrella piece of Coretta Scott King and the civil rights movement, right? And of course,
Mhm.
LBJ, and of course, Kissinger and Nixon, all of these names that Robert McNamara, like,
Mhm.
when you've studied, you know who these people are. But to have them in this additional context
Yeah.
really brings it to life.
And one of the goals for me was to try to thread the needle of being able to talk both about military history and talk about the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
Most histories we have don't talk about those on sort of
Right.
equal playing fields, and I think it's important to examine both because I think the at its core the book is really about patriotism and dissent. And I want people to be able to wrestle with both those things as being intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at a kind of weird point in our nation's history where sometimes it seems like you can only be patriotic and you can never say anything critical about the country, or you
Right.
can only be dissenting and can't express any sort of admiration or love for
Right.
aspects of our country. That's never been the reality for Black Americans. There's always
Right.
been this sort of vexed relationship, and I think for most Americans, we wrestle with it.
Yeah.
I want readers to be sort of thinking and wrestling with those questions. Think about what does it mean to fight for your
Yeah.
country, not just in the military sense, but in the sense of Coretta Scott King fighting for the country to live up to its ideals, to not be spending money on this war, but spend money on healthcare, on education, on taking care of American citizens.
Oh, J. Edgar Hoover was not a fan of either Martin Luther or Coretta Scott King. And to be able to sit though with historical record, right? And what you've done here with the combination of Skip and Coretta and sort of, the micro and the macro in one book. Um, I'm hoping that people sit with this and can pull out sort of the parallels, right? Like Arthur Schlesinger, right? The Cycles of American History. And every
Mhm.
time I think, oh, is it outdated? No, then history pops up and the world pops up, and I'm like, oh, right, the cycles of American history
Yeah.
are real. They're totally real. I want to talk about your background for a second, though, because
Mhm.
you had not planned to be a historian.
That's right. I mean, I try to tell my students this all the time, is that
Mm-hmm.
if you would have asked me when I was 22 what I was going to be when I grew up,
Mm-hmm.
historian would have been nowhere on that list. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so my mom, I need to give credit to my mom. She was the first person in our family to go to college. She went back to
Mm-hmm.
school after she had me and graduated from University of Minnesota. But I was the first person to go to a fancy college.
Yeah, yeah.
My mom cleaned houses for a living, and I got a chance to go to Harvard as undergrad. But like most of my graduating class, I ended up working in consulting after I graduated. I worked in business for 3 years, first in consulting,
Mm-hmm.
then through a professional contact, actually worked at Burger King Corporation in Miami,
Yep.
Florida. So my email address for a year and a half was mattdelmont@whopper.com. Um,
All right, that's excellent.
I had free Whopper coupons I was passing out to friends. If you bought a burger between 2002 2003
Mm-hmm.
at Burger King, I priced it. That was my job. I was pricing products. So I had no idea at all I was going to become a historian.
Right.
But I was working with someone who went to NYU to pursue a PhD in philosophy. And it was the
Yeah.
first time I ever learned that you could get a fellowship, not have to pay to be able to go to
Yeah.
graduate school. And that was sort of a light bulb moment for me. And so I ended up applying to graduate school. I applied to 6 places, only got into one. I got into Brown in
Mm-hmm.
the American Studies program. And then from that point forward, this has been my path in my life,
Right.
and I think it worked out really well. I'm really good at this, much better than I was as a consultant. I didn't shift enough paradigms as a consultant to really be excellent. So
Yeah, this is why you write books. No, this is why we need people to write books. I think, I mean, I don't know how much you get to read for pleasure outside, because obviously when you're teaching and whatnot, like you have to sort of pick and choose how things happen. But I get a lot of pleasure out of reading history, not because I feel like I'm sort of being fed my cultural vegetables, like this is an important thing, you must read this, but it's more like, how do I figure out what I think about something,
mhm.
right? And that's um yeah, even as like a small person, I was like, so what's the deal? And of course, you have to get suspicious about some of the records sometimes, and like who's telling the story and how are they
Mhm.
telling it? And like, oh, William Westmoreland's back. And I will say one of the pivotal points for Skip is the reporting of the My Lai massacre
Mhm.
and what William Calley's troops did in Vietnam. And it's, if you don't know the story, it is one of the biggest war crimes ever committed on behalf of anyone, anywhere. And I got to tell you, it does not make for great bedtime reading. I went digging around. There's that 4 hours in My Lai based on the
Yeah,
documentary. Yeah, that's not something you want to read before bed. That you
yeah,
just don't want to read before bed.
yeah. No,
However, it's really interesting to me to see sort of those patterns reappear, right? And what does that mean for
yeah.
us as humans? And what does that mean for the American military? And like we saw it in Abu Ghraib, we've seen like, have we not learned? Really, have we not learned? And that's part of what I'm concerned about when I look a little bit back and I'm like, this wasn't that long ago. You're writing about the
Yeah.
1960s. It's not like you're writing about the 1860s.
Yeah, that is one of the hard things about being a historian. I mean, in the
Hmm.
plus column is I get to be professionally curious. Right?
Hmm.
That's an amazing thing, right? My job is to try to be curious
Right,
so it's almost like detective work. Like you're trying to find all
right,
these different puzzle pieces and put them together. But there is a feeling of almost hopelessness sometimes when you
right,
see current events happen and see the the seeming inability of our country to learn from its past, right?
right.
With my last book about World War II, I was writing a chapter about the black veterans who encountered violence who were killed when they came home to the country. But I was writing that chapter in the summer of 2020, right, as
Right,
we're having this outpouring
right.
of protests against the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. That was a hard moment, right? Like just
Yeah.
literally trying to sit down and write that history was hard. The same thing with this book, thinking about the what our country has or has not learned from the Vietnam era.
Hmm.
Even just basic things about how to care for American servicemen and women when they come home,
Right,
right? If we're
right.
going to be a country that, for most of my adult life, our country's been at war, right?
Yeah.
If that's going to be the reality, like, we need
Hmm.
to do an equally good job of caring for veterans when they come home, not just saluting our troops and saying good luck with what you've had to deal with.
And also who are recruiting. Like, I mean, there are certain
Yeah.
parts of LA, like when you're driving through LA, you'll see a lot of recruitment billboards in certain neighborhoods. You
Mhm.
will absolutely not see them in others, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that I it makes me itch. I mean,
Yeah.
especially if I would not like to see the return of the draft, thank you very much. But I think we need to ask who's fighting, where are they fighting, and what are we asking them to do? I'm going to ask you to explain the title, though, of Half American, which is your earlier book about Black Americans fighting in World War II, because, we have this idea, right, of the greatest generation.
Hmm.
And, there have been some movies that have sort of addressed it in pop culture, but I don't feel like we certainly haven't taught this kind of material to the extent where maybe we've taught Vietnam.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. So the title of the book Half American comes from a letter written by a man named James G. Thompson.
Hmm.
He was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas. And in late December 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he writes this amazing letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the
Yeah.
largest and most influential black newspaper in the country.
Hmm.
The letter asks, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the
Right.
America I know worth defending? And it was that
Right.
phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, that stuck with me. It's why I chose Half American as the title of the book.
Hmm.
What Thompson was asking was a question that was on the minds of a lot of Black Americans at the time. What does it
Right.
mean to be asked to fight for, or potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? So the Pittsburgh Courier used Thompson's letter to launch
Hmm.
what was called the Double Victory Campaign, which was
Right.
really the rallying cry for Black Americans in the war. Victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And so for me, there are so many interesting connections between the World War II era and the Vietnam era, and even into our present. So thinking about
Hmm.
the fight against fascism and how that was won in some ways, not in other ways. But I hadn't anticipated becoming a military historian, but I'm excited and interested and invested in trying to make these stories sort of part of the way we understand American history and make sure that the African American perspective is front and center when we think about that military experience.
Well, I mean, that professional curiosity, right? Like, what a way to make a living. That's kind of great. It's kind of like being a bookseller, only I think you're tied to your office more than I am.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea that you can just go off and wander, right? And find maybe a thing, and maybe it's something you're expecting to find, and maybe it's something that surprises you. Just listening to you in the course of the conversation is you were actually surprised by things you found. Like the historical record is not a static thing.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. I mean, that's the most exciting part of
Hmm.
this work, right? Is that you learn so much in the course of it. I mean, for this current book, I learned a huge amount about Coretta Scott King's life and activism and legacy. I
Hmm.
mean, I knew the broad contours, but the range of places she was, the number of speeches she gave, the way that she phrased these things, and how people responded, right?
Hmm.
Reading the responses of people who saw her speak or who marched alongside her, that they kept coming back to this idea that her presence, just from your presence, was powerful. That she felt like
Hmm.
they raised that she raised them up just by being there.
Yeah.
I think the way I try to phrase it in the book is that she made it possible for people to be bold together.
Hmm.
Right? We think about people coming in the streets. They didn't necessarily have the courage to march spontaneously, but they thought,
Hmm.
if she's here, if we're part of something larger, we can do it. And then with Skip's story, I mean, having the chance to do oral histories. So I spoke with Katrina, his wife. I spoke with a dozen men who served with him in the 69th Armor. Hearing the stories about what it meant to serve in one of these
Hmm.
tanks and just sort of the logistics of how that worked, hearing her stories about her love for Skip, her loss, that's those are are powerful, and it's what makes this job fun. But also, I think it's part of my my role is to try to bring these stories to as many readers as possible.
Yeah, and I'm just going to point out you were able to interview these people in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
In person. I mean, or over the phone, whatever. Like
yeah,
you were able to sit with people. Like we have this idea that history is something that happened so long ago that maybe it doesn't affect us, or maybe it doesn't do this, or, I grew up in Massachusetts. I probably know more about pilgrims than I would have chosen to know. But however, like we should be able to ask questions about sort of how we look at American mythology, right? Like
yeah.
think about how we look at the opening of the American West, right? All of that kind of thing, and cowboy culture, and they're just a million different things. And we tell ourselves versions of these stories. And I'm like, but what about the people who were there?
Yeah. Yeah,
Right?
this history is not that long ago.
Yeah.
I was thankful to win an award for Half America and had a chance to go to Cleveland to accept it. And one of the people I was able to acknowledge there was a man named Robert Madison,
Uh-huh.
who served in World War II, earned medals for
Hmm.
his conduct. He was 100 years old when he was there. He's still with us today. He's 102 years old. Or last night I was giving a presentation in Detroit at
Yeah.
a black bookstore there called The Source.
Yeah.
And the daughter of one of the activists I talk about in this book, General Baker, he was one of the
Yeah.
first black men to refuse induction. He wrote this famous letter that got published in what became the Black Panther
Mm,
newspaper and got published everywhere. He was protesting outside of Skip's high school in Detroit. His daughter was there, right?
I think that's so cool.
Right? I try to tell my students, I don't know if they believe me, but these histories are
Mm,
not that long ago, right? They're
yeah.
often in the living memories of our parents, our grandparents, and they're certainly sort of baked into our schools, our communities, and certainly into our nation.
Mm. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that John Lewis accepted a National Book Award, and I'm watching and I'm just like, that's John Lewis.
Yeah.
That's John Lewis talking about okay, I'm looking at John Lewis. I mean, and it was only a couple of years ago, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just not, you know, I'm glad that we can continue to add to the record, right? Like it's kind of like literature in general,
Mhm.
European literature, American canon, like can we play with the idea of canon? And it's like, can we play with the idea of who gets to tell history and how? And like
Yeah.
who have we accidentally missed? Who have we missed intentionally? I think we're all served by questioning historical record as much as possible. And I
Yeah.
think everyone benefits when it's like, well, why did we say this? I mean, especially if you look back at the way sort of the reportage happens on Vietnam, it's Walter Cronkite who does, in fact, help turn the tide. Coretta Scott King certainly has her piece of it, but we also kind of needed Walter Cronkite
Mhm.
on the news saying this is horrific.
Absolutely. And I mean, so thinking about the kind of big picture history, it's one of the things that's so
Hmm.
frustrating right now about these efforts to limit how history is taught or limit what's in the Smithsonian. This idea that we're going to have one single story and it's going to
Right?
make everyone happy and we're going to focus on the positive celebratory parts. It's both bad history, but it's also boring, right?
Yeah.
It's like just watching a highlight tape of touchdown for touchdown for touchdown. Like that's not the interesting part of history. History is interesting because it's messy, it's complicated. It inspires us at some points, it frustrates us at other points, makes
Yeah.
us angry. But that's the reality of what history is.
But also, we're not monoculture is sort of how we all grew up, right? Like there were three television networks and there was, one or two newspapers in everyone's town, and your parents took whichever paper they took, kind of thing, right? And we're at a point where there are many more voices chiming in, and also we're losing news outlets at kind of an alarming rate. Um, so what does it look like to record history, right? Like, you and I probably have a little overlap with the microfiche era. Like, ugh,
Hmm.
may I never have to feed a microfiche machine again. But at the same time, I don't want to lose those records. You can't like link rot is real. I don't want to
Hmm.
digitize everything because also it's really hard to read some like handwriting. People don't know how to read cursive anymore. Like, how do we hold on to an actual living, breathing archive?
I think it's a real challenge. Like I don't know what history is going to look like 20,
Mm,
30 years down the road. But I think a commitment to evidence is
yeah,
important.
right.
And I think as we think about creating sort of a new set of historical records and documents, thinking about where is that evidence going to live in a way that
Right.
we being those people, can
Yeah.
look back on 30 years from now and be able to say, this actually did happen. I think in part it starts with a commitment to sort of truth and evidence in the
Hmm.
present, in our present media, that it's not just opinion based. It's not just, hey, here's what I think about X, but here's how I know this to be either true or not true. I mean, that's what historians do. That's what all the notes are in the back of these books, right? It's like here's how I know this assertion I'm making is actually based on something.
I gotta say, I do like the rabbit hole of footnotes.
It's the best
I
part.
do. I really like, there are times, I mean, did I maybe order a copy of Arthur Schlesinger's Bitter Harvest? That's his book
Yeah,
about Vietnam. And I was like,
yeah,
oh, I didn't know dude had written this. Am I waiting for it to show up? I
yeah.
am. I mean, I don't know how much of I'm actually going to make through, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, I didn't realize this. I don't know how I missed it. It's just sometimes you miss stuff, whatever. But I love the idea that I can get my hands on this very weird academic book that, oh,
Yeah, I mean the footnotes are where the action happens, right? That's
right?
we all of us as writers are trying, at least as historians, are trying to build
Yeah.
on work that has come before us and trying to set up the foundation for people who are going to write
Mm.
after us, right? These are always conversations that emerge over decades.
And I think the other thing you deserve credit for, though, is this is very readable. Like, I never felt like I was reading you know, sometimes you get handed a book and you're like, oh, this is a very serious history. Like,
Yeah,
it's really fun to read Ned Blackhawk. Like he just like, and I know it's Yale University Press, but he's really fun to read. You're really
yeah.
fun to read. But I'm wondering too, as a professor and a very
Hmm.
serious historian, like how do you find that balance between being readable, right? Because obviously you want people to share in these stories, but also respecting the work and the people and the actual evidence,
Mhm.
Like, who are some of the people who helped you become this very readable historian?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think some of the contemporary writers I admire, Taya Miles' work
Yo,
is
she's
amazing.
so great. I will read anything she could post her grocery list and I would read that
Ty
too.
Miles is great. Annette Gordon-Reed is
Yep.
great. Dartmouth alum. Shout out to
Yep.
Big Green. Um, Jean Theoharis
Yes.
is a friend who's a historian. Her book's on Rosa Parks and Martin Luther
Yep.
King. And then an academic text that I wasn't necessarily a popular book on history of anti-miscegenation laws by a historian who's now passed named Peggy Pascoe.
Oh
It's
wow.
called What Comes Naturally. That one still sticks in my head because it was more academic focused, but
Hmm.
the clarity with which he said these laws were about white supremacy, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
No.
I it always stuck in my head as like she had the evidence and she just made a clear argument. And then I think obviously with this book and Half American, they were my first books for trade audiences,
Yeah.
right? They're my fifth and sixth book overall, but my first two for
Hmm.
trade audiences, and so I have to give credit to my editor and Ibrahim Ahmed and at
He's a
Viking.
good dude.
He's
He's a
yeah,
really good dude.
nice dude, great editor, and I think really encouraged me to sort of to learn how to write in this way, right? Because
Yeah, yeah.
as academics, we don't learn how to write this way, right? We
Oh
learn
no,
how
you
to
don't. With all respect, you do not.
like we learn how to do a lot of research and then just like
Yeah.
dump that research into like block paragraphs, like just hit them with the research, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what gets you tenure, right? And so
Yes,
my
yes.
pathway was traditional like everyone else's,
Hmm.
and so I'm glad I'm at a stage of my career where I can still do evidence-based research, but or writing, but have it try to read like a story.
Well, I think that's really important though, because again, like history is a record of us,
Yeah.
right? Like, and that's the thing that I keep trying to stress with pretty much any, I like to stand on my hill and yell about things, but the idea that all of these pieces come together to tell a history of America, right? There
Hmm.
is no one version of this place. There is no one version of us.
Hmm.
And it is us, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah, it's
that's
our
the thing.
shared history. It's our
Yeah.
shared history, right?
And I love that, like Ron Takaki, A Different Mirror, right? Like that's been
Hmm.
reissued with an introduction by Clint Smith. And I'm just like,
Hmm.
this is so exciting because now maybe all of the folks who read How the Word is Passed will be like, who's this Ron Takaki guy? Because
Yeah,
it has been a minute since, I mean, A Different Mirror pubbed early 90s, maybe?
I think that's
Like
right.
it's
Yeah.
been a minute.
Yeah.
But I love the idea that they can be on the shelf
Yeah.
together and that someone can sort of be like, oh, or we've got Viet Thanh Nguyen writing about the Vietnam War from a very different perspective, right?
Yeah.
All
And
of this.
I think most people get it. I mean, at this
Hmm.
point, I've given more than 75 presentations on Half American all over the
Right,
country. I've spoken to
right.
high school audiences, to senior centers, spoken to military audiences,
Yep.
to older audiences. I mean, across the demographic spectrum in terms
Hmm.
of all manners. People get it. People are interested in history. They're interested in our shared history. And so I think a lot of what happens on cable news and sort of the fights people are having about things, I don't think they reflect the level of curiosity and interest most average Americans have in just understanding the fascinating, messy history of our country.
Can we just sit with your audiences for a second? Because I love the idea that you've done like the military, the civilian, the older folks, and the high school students. Like, do you see a common through line for all? Is it that shared history of our country that like connects all of these disparate groups?
I mean, I think people like stories, right? And they like
Yeah,
learning things they didn't know.
yeah.
Um, and I think the parts of the presentations that would resonate they resonate differently with different audiences, right? So I
Hmm.
think some people like to learn about new sort of black heroes from the war. Some people like
Yeah.
the stories of women in World War II. But everyone, I think, has been able to find something.
Yeah.
When I mentioned the military audiences, I did present Half American to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and to the Navy War
Yeah.
College in Newport, Rhode Island, and they were very receptive because they understood it
Hmm.
as a institutional history. They
Yeah.
understood the progress that the military had made since World War II to try to think about what it means to be an integrated force, right? Not to be politically correct, but because they're a more efficient, lethal fighting force if they can actually take advantage of the people power of all Americans. The frustrating paradox of that is this time last year I was scheduled to go back to the U.S. Army War College, but under the new administration, they stopped celebrating Black History Month, and so they disinvited me about a week before I was
Right.
supposed to go. Right, so same book, but now it's different political context, and now it's too hot for some audiences.
And I really don't think that politics changes the fact of the record, right? Like you're talking about the evidence. Like you are
Yeah.
going through, you're sitting in an archive, right? And an archive, again, I would argue, is a living, breathing thing. Like the Library of Congress is an amazing resource. Like if
Yeah.
you've ever stood in that hallway and thought, oh my,
Yeah.
it's impressive. Like we have library systems that are amazing places.
Yeah. And one of the things I try to tell people when I present either about Until the Last Gun is Silent or about Half American is the
Mm,
things I write about in these books are true regardless of whether President Trump's in the White House or Biden or Obama or Bush or whoever's in the White House in the
yeah.
future, right? We don't swing with political winds as scholars, as teachers, as historians. Our commitment is to trying to tell the truth as fully and as accurately as possible. And I think that's what I've been able to do with these last two books, and it's trying to convince people, persuade people that that's how they should meet the work.
I'm hoping that listeners really understand that one of the things you do so well is you just capture this moment in the 60s, right? Like we're there sort of 61 to, actually 75. We should all think of the early 70s as being part of the 60s, right? Like
Mhm.
just shocking amounts of change. But I got a lot of, I don't want to say pleasure is not necessarily the word. I really did enjoy reading this very serious sort of look at where we are and where we were sort of in the same set of pages.
Yeah.
And I'm really hoping people come to this with sort of an open mind because I think there's a lot to learn.
Mhm.
But also like the story is just good. Like you tell a great story in this book. And I really hope people understand that that's what we've been talking about in the last
I,
little bit.
I appreciate it. It was sort of that was my goal. And even when I write about hard things, I mean, there's some challenging moments in the book. I still try to make it a good story. I think these are compelling characters. There's love in the book. There's happiness. There's tragedy. There's all these different emotions. I think particularly the thing about Coretta Scott King's story, her visionary call for America to live up to the best version of its ideals, I think is a timeless through line that I think about almost every day.
And it also seems like a really great place to end this episode. So Matthew Delmont, thank you so much. Until the Last Gun is Silent is out now.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I get to talk to Wil Haygood today, and you guys get to listen in. He's the author now of 10 books, and the newest one is The War Within a War, The Black Struggle in Vietnam and at Home. And it is impossibly timely. And I mean, if you think about it, Vietnam was not that long ago. And it, well, also wasn't a 3-year war. I'm going to ask Wil to tell that story because he was telling me before we started taping that he'd had a conversation. I was like, huh, history is getting weird and how we talk about history is getting weird. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have Wil on the show so we could walk through sort of, well, the echoes of history, right? Like, I mean, Arthur Schlesinger and the Cycles of American History, I've referenced this book before in the show, but it feels like we're in this moment, right?
Yeah.
Again. And I'm going to ask you to set up our conversation, though, Wil, by talking about the story you just told me, where you had someone say, well, I thought the Vietnam War only lasted for X amount of years.
Yes. Thank you. Such an honor to be on the show with you. Thank you for having me. Um, I was curious yesterday. I ran into someone who was in their 20s,
Mm-hmm.
early 20s, and they asked me the subject matter of my forthcoming book.
Mm-hmm.
And I told them it was about the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was this sort of blank look on her face. And I said, hey, How long, how long, Sherry, do you think the Vietnam War lasted?
Mm-hmm.
She paused and then she said, 3 years?
Right.
3 years. And I was taken aback and I was saddened, sort of thinking to myself, wow, what are they learning in school? I mean,
Yeah.
talking about the Vietnam War, 12 plus years,
Right.
so more than a full decade
Mm-hmm.
of a war. And that's history that should be drilled into all of us.
Right. 3 administrations. We went from Kennedy to LBJ to Nixon. One
Nixon.
war, three administrations. But here's the thing. Until now, I mean, you've done biographies of, Thurgood Marshall and Adam Clayton Powell and Sammy Davis Jr. and who else? There was somebody else.
Sugar,
Um, Sugar Ray Robinson. So, I mean, you've worked in sort of this Well, you've worked in biography before and using a larger sort of American scale, right, to tell these stories of these major figures. But in War Within a War, we get a mix of names we've heard. I mean, Barry Gordy and Marvin Gaye show up in this book.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks we haven't met. And I'm just wondering, how did this book start for you? I mean, you were a working journalist for years and years and years. You were with Boston Globe, Washington Post. You've written, again, 10 books. So this book, though, feels slightly different from some of the previous work. And I'm just wondering where it started and how you decided on who you were going to feature in the book.
And you are right. You are right. It is much different. And when I came up with the idea with my editor, Peter Gethers,
Mm-hmm.
both of us thought, how do you make the big epic Vietnam War intimate enough for people to see? And I thought about my childhood. I grew up on North 5th Street in Columbus, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a guy who lived directly across the street from me by the name of Skip Dunn. And he was in high school, and I was
Mm-hmm.
in seventh grade. And I would wave to him every morning. Hey, Skip, how you doing? And he would wave to me. Hey, Will. Skip was one of those guys who you would look up to. He was a sports hero.
Yeah.
He taught me how to throw horseshoes. And then there was a period for about 2 weeks where I didn't see Skip. And I asked
Right.
my older sister, who had been in high school with him, I said, where's Skip at? I haven't seen him. And my sister said, Skip has gone off to Vietnam.
Mm.
Now, I was 13 years old, really didn't know what Vietnam meant or was.
Mm-hmm.
And then my mother moved to the east side of town into a housing project, which was segregated, all black, in 1968. We moved
Right.
there in the early summer of 1968.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, the neighborhood erupted in fire and rebellion
Right.
as a rebuke to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And I would find myself, I found myself in the summertime running from National Guard troops in tanks.
Yeah.
We were supposed to be off the street. So here I
Mm-hmm.
am, a 13-year-old kid who has experienced these two moments. On the
Mm-hmm.
north side, there was not only Skip Dunn, who had vanished from the neighborhood, there were 5 other cats, young
Yeah.
black guys, and I knew all of them. They also had gone off to Vietnam. And then the other spectrum is all of the fire and rebellion that erupted on the east side of town. So I saw both of those things in my youth. So then I said to myself, that's the way into the book, to relate that experience as a kid, and then to use all of my narrative skills, all of my biographical journey skills, search, to find people who I could tell the story of the war through.
Right. Right.
So that's how it all kind of was birthed.
Well, I think I'm going to be quoting you quite a lot in the course of this conversation because one of the things you mentioned is, and in 1966, when the summer you're talking about, when you're 13, 3% of the general population of the United States is black. 13% of the soldiers in Vietnam are black. Those numbers are wild.
Yes.
That is an incredible swing.
Yeah.
And, you know, and certainly Martin Luther King's legacy, he didn't, you know, Coretta obviously pushed him to be a little more anti-war before he was ready to be really out front anti-war. And he caught a lot of flack for coming out against the war. LBJ was furious at him, absolutely furious at him. The context that we have, it's almost like, well, we were fighting this war overseas, and what does that have to do with anything at home? And yet you connect the dots across so many different pieces. We've got career military, we've got nurses, we've got the concert pianist who decides to rescue orphans.
Yes.
I mean, you really have this swing of people, and again, Barry Gordy and Marvin Gaye. How do you edit down? I mean, does the research take you to the story, or does the story take you to the research? I mean, you start with the personal, I get it, but
Yes, yes. One of the things that I um, had to do was mailed uh, mailed this story of war
hmm
with the Civil Rights Revolution.
right, right.
People rarely do that when talking about the Vietnam War. There are
Right.
whole books about the Vietnam War,
hmm
and this side of the battle is nary mentioned. And
Yeah.
so I knew that this was a big area to probe, to
Yeah.
look into.
hmm
And so when I started finding these soldiers,
hmm
interviewing them, um, I even got to Lloyd Austin, the former
Right.
Secretary of Defense, because he had a relative who was in Vietnam.
hmm
But to a person, uh, these soldiers would get tears in their eyes toward the end of the interview and say, "Thank you. You're the first person I've talked to about the war. Nobody else has ever come around knocking on my door."
Right.
And you talk about those numbers.
hmm
Well, it was a vast gap. 97% of the draft boards were all white.
hmm
Now, I'm not saying all those people who sat on those draft boards were racist, but I
Right.
am saying that when you compare the numbers, white and black, there were more blacks proportionately drafted than whites. Also, there were more whites in college, so they could get the college deferments,
Right.
and the black soldiers or recruits could not. And so you obviously were going to have a large number of blacks going to the front lines. It was President John F. Kennedy who realized something was askew early on when he said, "Hey, we have to be careful that this is not seen, quote, as a white man's war," which
Yep.
is which is exactly what it turned out to be.
Right. I'm also thinking about Robert McNamara and his 100,000 man project. And he was just like, well, no, 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 we'll just go through the cities and we'll pick the people we need. I mean, I went to a college in New England that actually had done away with grades. So it had previously been all men and it went co-ed in the 70s. But they had done away with grades so that young men could not be drafted based on their
Mhm.
GPAs. I believe they have grades now, but this was a minute ago. I was the tail end of let's not do grades. Although we had other ways of measuring things. So the idea that, this is the first fully integrated US fighting force in a
Yes,
war, right?
yeah,
And so yay, hurrah, we're integrated, but then we still can't get it right. And that's the thing where I'm just the classism and the inequality and just all of the pieces that we just one step forward, three steps back, right? You have this great line too in the book. The Vietnam years got dark and edgy and witchy and funky and horrific rather quickly. And it does. It feels like we went from, I mean, yes, the war had been building over time and we were there from sort of the early 60s until almost the mid 70s. But I would say the bulk of the American imagination when it comes to the Vietnam War sort of lands squarely between 65 and 71,
yes, you're right.
right?
Yes,
So, I mean, if you think about what's happening in music, you think about what's happening in film, if you think about what's happening in the media in general,
right.
that's a very tiny moment, but it's very, very powerful in a
Yes,
lot of ways.
yes. I mean, a black soldier could be in Vietnam and could have fought one day and go back to their base camp
Mm,
and go to sleep and wake up the next morning and find a Confederate flag flying
right.
outside their tent. Can you imagine what that must have done to these cats who are
hmm
already hearing from relatives back home that, hey, I
Mm,
took mom to vote in Savannah and they wouldn't let her vote.
right.
And so you have this split screen. in their mindset, like, wow, I'm fighting for a nation that is still not respecting my folks.
Right.
Even though the 64 and the 65 and the 68 civil rights bills have passed, it didn't mean that everybody enforced those bills with the full weight of the law. And also, 1964, you have the three murders in Mississippi, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. And all of this news reached these guys in Vietnam, and so they were worried about that. They were worried that they were going to get in trouble if their afro was too long. They were worried that they were going to get in trouble if they utilized their DAP handshake,
Right.
Which was sort of a soulful handshake, as you know.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really delights me about the War Within a War is you tell the story of Wallace Terry, excuse me.
Yeah.
And his career is kind of legendary, and yet not everyone recognizes his name. And there was a book that came out in '84, Random House published it, called Bloods.
Right.
And it's an oral history of Black soldiers in Vietnam, in their own words. It's very much like Studs Terkel's Working, which is kind of also kind of a legendary portrait of America. I have not read Working in a really long time, but I remember tearing through it as a teenager.
Yeah.
And when Terkel was still alive, you would constantly see him like on the news or on television or hear him on the radio kind of thing.
Right.
I kind of miss having him around.
Yeah.
But I love the idea that you profile Terry and really get in there, and you get to talk to his widow and all of the people around him. Can we just introduce folks to Wallace Terry? Because I think he's a pretty cool dude. And
Wallace Terry was a young African American. He went to Brown University. He had a wonderful job on the student newspaper. And he wanted to become a newspaper man, and he was hired to work at the Washington Post, one of the first blacks there, and then he went to Time Magazine. And when he was at Time Magazine, the editors at Time Magazine had heard rumors that the black soldiers were having problems.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Terry, because he was talking to someone once and he asked them, how's the situation with the black-white situation in the war? And this person told Terry, he said, man, the blacks are fighting a war within a war.
Right.
The blacks are fighting a war within a war. And so Terry's editors at Time Magazine eventually came up with an idea, hey, we have to do a special issue about, as they said in the title, the Negro in Vietnam. And so they did. And that issue seemed to catch white America off guard, because white America was thinking, hey, you are a full citizen, you have a job, you should be happy to fight, that we allow you to fight for our nation. So what is there to complain about?
Right.
And so the black soldiers, of course, in the field had to be very careful in talking to Terry, because they didn't want to get in trouble from their complaints about the military. But Terry was very affected by the black soldiers that he met.
But also he was in a position to get the editorial sort of directors of Time Magazine, which at the time, like Time Magazine in the 1960s was a global brand. It carried quite a lot of weight. I mean, in some cases could influence policy, say, but also reinforced. I mean, the American presence globally was a very different thing in the 60s as it is now. And that's not to say that we are not still doing things that we should not do, but it, the way it was presented to the general public was a very different
Yes.
experience. And for Terry to get in there and be able to talk to guys without being censored by the military, this is huge, right? This is the first
Right.
war where the US military isn't saying, well, you can't write that. I mean, a lot of what we have from certainly World War II and the Korean War, a lot of it was heavily redacted until it wasn't.
Right.
And so we get some very specific kinds of coverage.
Right.
And
Right.
Vietnam, if you think about like Michael Hare's dispatches or some of the reporting that Halberstam did, again, missing chunks of it, but David Halberstam is also one of the reporters who said, hey, Vietnam is making me think about Mississippi. He had covered the civil rights movement in
Right.
Mississippi for the New York Times and some other outlets, but same thing. And this is Halberstam, the dude
Right.
with the Pulitzer going, this doesn't feel right.
Howard Sam said something very profound
Hmm.
when he landed uh, in Vietnam and looked around and
Hmm.
spent some days. He said, "There's a lot about Mississippi
Yeah.
that reminds me of Vietnam. And
Hmm.
there's a lot about Vietnam that reminds me of Mississippi."
Yeah.
That was mind blowing to
Hmm.
me. I mean, that was absolutely mind blowing that a lot of the officers, Southern officers,
Hmm.
Citadel, West Point, or wherever,
Right.
had taken some of their same customs over to the war zone.
Right.
And the black soldiers had said, no, enough
Right.
of this. I don't want anybody to call me the N word again.
Right.
And
Right.
so there were battles. There were battles on the battlefield, uh, and there were battles away from the battlefield.
Yeah. Terry also, though, as a reporter, I mean, it sounds to me like he came back with what sounds like PTSD, what we would call PTSD now. I mean, and when he came back to the States,
Absolutely.
that was not in the lexicon, right? That was not part of the
Right,
DSM. Like the VA was not diagnosing people with PTSD.
right.
Um, it sounds like sort of readjusting. I mean, and if I remember the way you tell the story in the book, he gets back to DC but doesn't call his mother. And finally, someone from the paper calls him and says, dude, you have to, or from Time Magazine calls and says, you have to call your mom and let her know you're back in the United States. And he was like, I actually don't think I can pick up the phone. I mean,
Yes,
that is a profound experience. And we don't often give men, and certainly not men of color, space to talk about that kind of emotional damage.
right. And then there was this side of the story. He was
Hmm.
trying to write a book,
Right,
and no publisher would accept it
right.
until he finally came up with the idea to do an oral history. And he reached out to uh, Earl.
Errol
Earl,
McDonald, actually. Yeah, Errol McDonald, who is a colleague of Peter Gether's. But
yeah,
yeah,
real smart, savvy editor,
yeah,
and he took it on. And I think that this book became Wallace Terry's calling.
yeah, without a doubt. Without a
You
doubt.
know, it became his calling.
Hmm. I think one of the things I hope readers get out of War Within a War too is to understand how universal a lot of these experiences were. Right? Like, I mean, you talk about guys who are like, well, at least I got to finish medical school before I got drafted. And yet here I am treating folks, or we've got the French came in and filmed a young man, but that changed his trajectory because all of a sudden the army was like, yeah, we kind of need to use you in PR, please. And he was like, okay.
That is a great story.
Right.
Yes,
Can we tell that story? I mean, it's just,
yes,
I really loved it. And I had no idea that there was a French film that came
yes.
out of this.
There was a wonderful guy, wonderful gentleman who I interviewed. He's in Michigan now,
Hmm.
named Joe Anderson.
Yep.
He went to West Point. He came out of West Point. He became an officer in Vietnam. There were very, very, very few officers in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, a black soldier could serve in Vietnam during his year-long stint and
Hmm.
never be under under the orbit of a Black officer
Right.
for a whole year.
Right.
And so, which shows you how few Black officers there were. But Joe Anderson was told to go rescue some trapped soldiers in the highlands. And his mission was successful. And his troops said, "Oh, wow, you have done an amazing job. You are going to get a medal, et cetera, et cetera." When he got back to camp, there was a French filmmaker who had heard about this. And the French filmmaker said, "Hey, I would like to go out with you on your next mission. And do you think I will be able to do that?" And then Joe Anderson said, "Well, I don't know. You have to ask the higher ups." Now, this was a French filmmaker,
Right.
American.
Right.
No American filmmakers in the vicinity wanted to make a movie about a Black hero in the Vietnam War. But the French, who accepted a lot of Black artists during the 20s and 30s and 40s, had a different mindset. And so this French filmmaker went out with Joe Anderson, shot all kind of footage over a period of 2 weeks in the swamps during firefights and everything. And he had all this footage. He went back to France and edited it and made his little film. He thought might just play in little film festivals, maybe.
Right.
The film was called The Anderson Platoon.
Yep.
Lo and behold, and this documentary gets nominated for an Academy Award.
Right.
Lo and behold, on Oscar night, it wins. It wins the Oscar. So Joe Anderson really became the first Black cinematic star of the war.
Yeah.
Europeans knew that, but not many people in America did, because the media simply didn't pay attention to it as much as they did in Europe. But it is a gritty film, and I've watched it twice.
Yeah.
It has a whole lot of mood to it, has a lot of texture to it, and it's real. It's cinema verite. It's on the ground.
Berry Gordy also appears in War Within a War. Marvin Gaye, whose brother was fighting in Vietnam, which I didn't know. Also, Gordon Parks, the photographer, his son was fighting in Vietnam too. So, I mean, we're adding in very recognizable names. But it also sounds like Berry Gordy got a little radicalized too. He went from, he added a little more spoken word, as it were. Like, he put out an album that included recordings of soldiers who were featured in the Terry book Bloods, of them telling their stories on this album and sending it out. I mean, radio was a different thing then, television was a different thing then. So the idea, Martin Luther King's speeches were available on vinyl. Like, it was a totally different way of experiencing the world, where you just sat in your living room and could listen. And I love the idea that he was doing this sort of on the side with, all of the bands, and we love the bands. But it's kind of great. Like Stokely Carmichael had some stuff come out with Berry Gordy. I think it's kind of great.
Right. I mean, I give Marvin Gaye a whole lot of credit, because that album, What's Going On, it was seminal, and it also crossed over. So you had a lot of whites listening to that album.
Yep.
I remember in high school listening to that album, and it was just amazing. Brother, there's too many of you dying. War is not the answer. Only love can conquer hate. I mean, it was a seminal album, and he made you want to listen to an album about war. How many songwriters and singers can do that? Not many. Not many. Not many.
But again, it brings me back to the larger culture, right? Like, here we've got a French film, we've got music, we've got Walter Cronkite on the news saying this is unacceptable. Look at what's happening here. Why are we doing this? I mean, we've got Martin Luther King saying we really can't do this anymore.
Right.
We have, Watts in 65. We have certainly Detroit in 67. Again, 68, as you said, there was a lot. Actually, Boston kind of famously, WGBH in Boston played, um, oh, I'm blanking on the full story, but James Brown was supposed to play the Boston Garden that night, and he went
Yes,
on. And
yes,
WGBH in Boston, it was right after MLK was assassinated. And WGBH, the PBS channel in Boston, broadcast the entire James Brown concert,
yeah,
and people stayed home to watch
yeah,
James Brown for free
yeah, yes,
on
that's legendary.
WGBH in
Yeah,
Boston. So props to public television for that one.
yeah,
But
E.
it's when you think of the turmoil and you think of the trauma, um, I will laugh a little bit. Frank Lucas, the drug dealer and
Oh my
gangster
goodness.
from American Gangster, popped up, and I was like, oh, right, that guy.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, woo.
I mean, there are some characters. There are, but again, like, I don't know, part of me feels like we haven't changed all that much.
One of the things I think the war taught
Hmm.
the country is that um, those who decide to tell the war
Yeah.
their own vantage point,
Hmm.
they are often not left with the full truth.
Right.
The full truth. And the full truth is, facts like this. There
Right.
was a jail in Vietnam called
Oh, yeah.
the Long Bien Jail, and the
Hmm.
black soldiers christened it LBJ
Right.
because those were the initials of
Hmm.
Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Right.
At some points, there would be 75% black soldiers in that jail.
Right.
And 75%. And there would be only maybe 18% of black soldiers serving in Vietnam. And so it just said that black soldiers were more severely punished than the white soldiers were.
Mm.
And I tracked down a guy who was a lawyer for some of those
Hmm.
soldiers, and he said there was nothing fair
Right.
about the Long Bien jail. Now, there were people who should have been in there. I'm not saying that. There were people
Right.
who should have been in there, but there were also a lot who should not have been in there, who happened to have been black.
Is it chasing? I mean, did you plan on becoming a journalist?
No, no. When I came out of college at Miami of Ohio,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
uh, I went to New York City
Right.
and I just wanted to get away from my hometown.
Right.
And I got accepted into the executive training program at Macy's department store.
Oh, wow. Okay,
So
you
I
were going to go
started out,
retail.
yeah. So I started out my career in retail. And after 2 years of that, I was let go.
Ah.
I really wasn't cut out for it. One of the managers, lovely lady named Janet
Mm.
Moran, who I'm still in touch with, uh,
Uh-huh.
she was the one who actually sort of changed my life because one day, well, it was the day she was getting ready to fire me. She asked me to write, she asked me to go home and write
Hmm.
a story about what I really wanted to do in life. And I wrote
Oh.
some stuff just about my hometown. I was missing my little nieces.
Hmm.
And it was about, I don't know, 7 to 8 pages of just,
Right.
of just me riffing.
Hmm.
And she read it and she looked at me straight in the eye and she said, Wil Haygood, whatever you must do in life, you
Hmm.
ought to go and become a writer. That's literally what she said. She said, these 8 pages are so beautiful and
Hmm.
lovely and textured. You ought to go and become a writer.
Yeah.
And so, having no other option, I started writing newspaper editors all around the country. And I
Hmm.
ended up in Charleston, West Virginia. And then I went to the Pittsburgh Post Gazette and then the
Okay.
Boston Globe, where I became a foreign correspondent and
Right.
covered some wars. I went into war zones.
Yeah.
Uh,
Where were you covering for the Globe?
yeah, I was in Somalia.
Oh, wow.
and I was in Liberia,
Yeah. Okay.
and I was in Zimbabwe, and I was in South Africa.
Wow. I have a, just based on what the timeline looks like, none of those could have been comfortable, but chasing the story would have been great.
Yes, yes, it was. And that experience, and I think I was able to ease into writing a book about war,
Yeah.
how to winnow it down, how to tell these
Hmm.
stories about war and the men and women who fought.
Right.
And it was Peter Gethers, my editor, when we first started talking about this book, he said,
Mhm.
and we must have women.
Absolutely. I mean,
And so we do.
yeah, especially especially the nurses. We can't overlook the nurses. I feel like they constantly get left out. I'm like, well, who do you think was yeah,
Yeah, who you think was helping heal these people and
right.
help with surgeries and all that kind of stuff.
It's it's one of these moments, right, in American history. The 60s feel like they've caught our sort of collective imagination in ways that have become sort of canonized, right? But like I think people forget that the early 70s were bananas in the world, like
That's,
everywhere. I mean, planes were getting hijacked and like people were
yep,
bombing banks. I mean, it was the Wild West
yes,
everywhere.
yes,
And it's like we've collectively forgotten that the early 70s and then of course we had, gas and all of those kinds of, you couldn't even like if you had an even number on your license plate, you got gas one day, and if you had an odd number license plate, you got gas on a different day.
right.
I mean, it's almost as if we have collective amnesia. And I think
Yep.
Vietnam falls into that because
Me too.
it was such a disaster. It was such a disaster. And I feel like, well, are they using it now as a model to, keep fighting unwinnable wars or in places we probably shouldn't be?
Yes.
Because we're still trying to get over the war we lost. And this was the first time that America felt like it had lost a major moment.
Well, which goes to this too.
Hmm.
I was speaking to some students
Yeah.
recently, and there were about, I don't know, maybe 25 students in this class.
Hmm.
And I asked them, I said, how many of you think we won the war in Vietnam?
You're right.
About 20 of them raised their hands, thinking that
Wow.
we won. We did not
Right.
win. At best,
Boo.
it was a truce. It was a truce at best,
Mm,
and we left.
right.
We left. I mean, it was a formidable foe. It was a formidable
Yeah.
foe.
Well, and if you think about, sort of how America got started, I mean, essentially we stepped into someone's version of their own American Revolution, and
Yeah,
somehow we decided that we were going to make sure it went the right direction. I
yeah,
am. I think you're familiar with the historian Matthew Delmont too, and he has a book out. But Coretta Scott King features quite heavily in his narrative. And one of her things was the way she read, she's like, listen, Vietnam is much more a product of colonialism. And she came at it from an entirely different point of view. It wasn't just communism. She was like, listen, communism, it's a thing. I get it. But like, can we talk about the larger thing? And I love the idea that it's Coretta Scott King sort of prodding at her husband saying, hey, I know
mm,
you're thinking about the domestic things, but here's this other piece,
right.
right? That everything is so fully interconnected. Like, how do we take so much away from our domestic sphere,
Yeah. Well,
right?
something else too that I think
Hmm.
really, really had to hurt the psyche of the Black soldier.
Yeah,
When they came back from Vietnam, it still was hard to rent an apartment in many
right,
cities. It
right,
still was hard to get a good job.
right.
It still was hard to be fully respected as a human being. And, so you had people turning to crime and drugs,
Right.
which was awful.
Right. But also the military remains a genuine career path.
No doubt about it. I
And
mean, yes,
it's I mean, listen, to each their own and find the thing that's gonna, but part of me does look at it and say, well, how do you do this? How do you explain it to yourself? And obviously it works for people.
Right.
I'm not saying don't do it. I'm trying to understand how we get to this point.
Yeah. 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 How, uh, there is a quote at the beginning of the book
Hmm.
uh, from James Baldwin.
Yep.
And if I may read that,
Yes, please.
this is from James Baldwin, who, when I was a much younger journalist, I met him in person and did a story about him. Anyway,
Yeah.
James Baldwin says this quote,
Hmm.
long, long before the Americans decided to liberate the Southeast Asians, they decided to liberate me. My ancestors carried these scars to the grave, and
Hmm.
so will I. A racist society can't but fight a racist war. This is the bitter truth. The assumptions acted on at home are also acted on abroad. And every American Negro knows this, for he was the first Viet Cong victim. We were bombed first. James Baldwin.
When
That's
did you, yeah, when did you meet Baldwin?
I met Baldwin in 1985. I was at
Okay.
the Globe.
All
I
right.
had started. Yeah.
Okay. So this is after he's done the work down, because he wrote about the civil rights movement for Esquire in
Yes.
what, the mid 60s,
Yes.
right? Do I have
Yes.
that timeline right? Okay. So mid 60s, the 70s, he's in Atlanta writing about the child murders.
Right. Right.
And then the 80s, he's sort of, I mean, he died in 91. So 80s, is he out, he's teaching out in Western Mass at this point, right?
Amherst,
Oh, so
UMass
he's okay.
Amherst.
So he's teaching at UMass Amherst.
That's where he and I met.
Okay.
And I interviewed him. Yeah.
And part of me is thinking he's probably still fight. I mean, I never met him in person, but um, he's probably still incredibly feisty. I mean, he was never a proponent of the war in Vietnam ever.
Oh no.
From minute one, he was like, "This is a bad idea. What is wrong with you people? Why are we
Right.
doing this? This is
Right.
terrible."
Right.
Um, but I'm wondering too, for you as a journalist, right? You've done all these other well, you've done some of the books at this point. And he's James Baldwin, and you're at the Globe and you covered wars and everything else. And I'm just wondering, like, how that experience was for you. I mean, he's still James Baldwin. I mean,
Listen. Yes. At that point in my life, I hadn't written a single book yet. I hadn't,
oh, okay. So the books came
single,
later. Oh, okay.
hadn't
Okay.
written a single book. So I'm sitting on this sofa
Yeah.
in this home interviewing James Baldwin.
Hmm.
And it's going so well that I said to myself, wow, when this is over, I'm going to ask him something personal.
Okay.
And so at the end of the interview, I said, and excuse me, Mr. Baldwin, may I
Hmm.
ask you something personal? He was smoking a cigarette. He said,
Yeah.
yeah, baby, what is it? Shoot, baby, what is it? What is it? And I said, sir, do you think I will someday be able to write books?
Mm.
And he looked at me very hard, took a drag of his cigarette and said, how the hell should I know that? I don't know who you are. I don't know what kind of drive and discipline you have, baby. What kind of question is that to ask me? And my heart sank. I felt like running out of the house. And then he scooted his chair a
Yeah.
little closer to me and he said, but whatever you do in life, baby, you
Yeah.
must go the way your blood beats.
Yeah.
Those words are in my home right now on the wall. Whatever you do in life, you must go the way your blood beats. That was profound
Yeah.
advice for me. And here I am 10 books later.
Well, and you've written about your family in Columbus. Again, Thurgood Marshall and Sammy Davis Jr. There's a book about Black cinema. I mean, you do, I mean, it's a good mix. It's a really
It's a good
it's
mix.
a good mix of story and character. I mean, I realize your family are, we're talking about real people, but at the same
Yeah,
time, you have to create a character on the page in order to represent
yeah.
all of these folks. I mean, have you started on the next thing? I mean, are you thinking, do you have multiple projects going? Like, how does that work for you?
Uh, me and my editor just came up with the idea for my next book.
Okay.
Mostly his idea, but I jumped right on it and I added
Mm.
some things to it. But it was mostly his idea. 100%
Yeah.
got to give Peter a lot of credit.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think I'm willing to talk about it publicly
That's
yet.
okay. You
Yeah,
don't listen. You're
but
working on a thing. That's okay.
yes, I'm putting the music together. Yes, I'm putting the
Okay.
music together.
That I can absolutely work with. I'm not going to tell you, but I am working on a thing. That listen, booksellers just like to know that there's another thing coming.
Yes, there is another thing coming. Yes, yes,
I mean, the story never ends, right? Especially if you're a journalist, there's always another piece. And that
yes,
maybe you're building on earlier work, maybe you're not. But
yeah,
I love the idea that there is a body of work that goes with Wil Haygood, journalist. And,
yeah,
I can recognize some topics that I think are of interest to you.
yeah,
But this War Within a War feels like it touches all of the work that came before.
yeah,
That's how it feels to me as a reader.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, maybe I'm wrong,
Mm,
but I don't think I am. I think it's my most timely book.
yes, without a doubt.
You
Without a doubt.
know, because what's been going on in the country,
Mm,
the world, and it was a bit of magic, I must admit,
hmm
to find the cover photograph on the book
It
because
is a great photo.
that is
I'm
Skip
I'm
Dunn.
holding the galley, but this is
Yes,
also the jacket for the finished
that is
copy.
Skip Dunn who lived right across the street from
Yeah.
me. Here's the actual book.
He looks so young.
Doesn't
He
it? I mean,
looks he's a teenager in that photo.
he was 18 years old. 18.
He's a baby.
He's a baby. Yes, you're right. I mean, the helmet seems too big for his
Yeah,
head.
it does. It
The
does.
helmet seems too big for his head. I
Yeah.
mean, his family, his widow will be joining me at some of my book tour
Good.
stops.
I'm
Yeah,
glad to hear that. I'm
yeah.
really glad to hear that. Okay, well, we're bumping up on time, and I knew that was going to happen. So I'm going to say thank you so much. I know you have a book to write. You have a book to write that I would like to read at some point, whenever that may come.
Yes,
But really, I appreciate the time so much. And War Within a War is out now.
it was such an honor to be on your show. I'm a fan of the show. Thank you so much. And you
Oh,
always read every word of every book.
I kind of do, but it's a nice life, right? But Will,
Yes,
seriously, thank you for making the time. I appreciate it.
thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.